It was supposed to be just another political debate, a primetime panel, familiar faces, and a routine back and forth about the future of American democracy. But within minutes, the set transformed into something no producer could control. The cameras were rolling, the microphones were hot, and Kellyanne Conway was unraveling in front of the nation. Her voice cut through the studio like shattered glass, rising higher and sharper with every sentence. The anchor tried to interject, shuffling papers nervously, but Conway plowed forward, hands slamming against the desk as though volume alone could make her case bulletproof. Viewers at home leaned forward, stunned, watching a seasoned political operative come apart in real time. It wasn't just disagreement, it was rage. Every syllable carried the weight of years spent defending the indefensible, years spent perfecting the art of alternative facts. And yet on this night, the polish was gone. Conway wasn't strategizing or spinning. She was screaming, her words tangled in frustration, her voice cracking as if the sheer intensity might break her. The lights in the studio felt harsher than usual, bouncing off her expression, clenched jaw, darting eyes, the unmistakable shadow of desperation. The control room whispered frantically into the host's earpiece, but there was no stopping the spectacle. For millions of Americans, it was like watching a dam burst, and then silence, not because Conway had finished, but because her own fury swallowed itself whole. The air felt heavy, electric, as if the entire room held its breath. One could almost hear the collective gasp of viewers across the country, frozen in their living rooms, wondering what would happen next. On the opposite side of the table sat Jasmine Crockett. She hadn't moved, she hadn't raised her voice. Her composure stood in jarring contrast to the storm raging just inches away. And it was that contrast, chaos versus calm, arrogance versus dignity, that made what followed so unshakably powerful. Because while Conway screamed to dominate the moment, Crockett was preparing to define it. Her silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Her stillness was not fear, it was control. And as the cameras zoomed in, the nation waited for her to speak. What Jasmine Crockett said next would not only cut through Conway's shouting, it would change the conversation entirely. To understand why this clash mattered, you have to see it for what it really was, not just a loud exchange between two political figures, but a collision of two Americas, colliding live under the unforgiving glow of television lights. The debate had been billed as yet another roundtable on the state of democracy, a routine segment in a media cycle overflowing with partisan fireworks. Producers expected sharp words, yes, but not history in the making. They had no idea they were about to capture a moment that would ripple far beyond their studio walls. Kellyanne Conway entered the stage with the same reputation that had followed her for years, Trump's relentless loyalist, the woman who had once spun alternative facts into a household phrase. To her admirers, she was a survivor, the political street fighter who had outlasted scandal after scandal. To her critics, she was the embodiment of spin without shame, a face that symbolized how truth itself could be twisted until it snapped. She thrived in chaos because chaos was her weapon. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a freshman Democrat whose rise seemed almost the perfect antidote to Conway's legacy. Young, sharp, unapologetically progressive, Crockett represented the voices that Conway had spent years dismissing. She was the daughter of resilience, a lawyer who had fought in courtrooms before fighting in Congress, a woman whose calm precision was as cutting as Conway's noise. On paper, it was a mismatch, the seasoned operator versus the rising newcomer. Conway had been on television for decades, sharpening her tongue and rehearsing her combative style. Crockett was still introducing herself to the national stage. Yet that imbalance was exactly what made the moment so dangerous for Conway, because in a polarized America, viewers weren't just looking for arguments, they were looking for symbols. This wasn't merely two women trading words. It was the clash between the old guard of spin and a new generation demanding truth. It was the noise of entitlement facing the quiet force of dignity, one America rooted in dominance, the other in progress. The symbolism was so stark that every second of the broadcast felt heavier, charged with meaning, and viewers felt it. Progressive audiences, long exhausted by years of manufactured outrage, leaned in as if willing Crockett to hold her ground. Conservative viewers bristled, rallying behind Conway's fury, insisting that volume was victory. Neutral onlookers, the dwindling middle, found themselves watching not just politics, but a performance that revealed character in its rawest form. The stakes could not have been higher. For Conway, it was survival of her persona, proof that she could still bend reality with sheer force. For Crockett, It was the chance to show America what a new kind of leadership looked like, one rooted not in spectacle, but in composure. And yet, in that moment when Conway's screams rattled the studio, Crockett did not flinch. She did not take the bait. She let the fury play out, letting Conway burn through her energy like a storm that had already passed its peak. The silence between them said more than any shouted insult could. It was the silence of a woman who understood that sometimes power lies, not in how loudly you speak, but in how deeply you're heard. But the silence could not last forever. The audience was waiting. The hosts were waiting. The nation was waiting, because if Conway's eruption had shocked viewers, what Crockett chose to say in its aftermath would determine whether the moment faded or ignited into something unforgettable. And nothing prepared the nation for the seconds that followed Conway's eruption. For years, Kellyanne Conway moved through American politics like a shadow with a microphone. To some, she was a genius of survival, a strategist who could out-talk and outmaneuver her rivals with dizzying speed. To others, she was the very embodiment of cynicism in politics, someone who could look directly into a camera and tell you the sky was red, and somehow leave half the country questioning their own eyes. Her career was built on contradiction. On one hand, Conway presented herself as polished, articulate, even maternal. She could disarm a hostile interview with a laugh, or pivot from a brutal question into a rehearsed talking point so seamlessly that anchors often didn't realize she had dodged them until it was too late. On the other hand, beneath the composure was an aggression so sharp it bordered on hostility. She thrived in confrontation, feeding off chaos like a spark that only grew hotter when it touched gasoline. The peak of her notoriety came during the Trump years. While others on his team stumbled under scrutiny, Conway leaned into it. She coined a phrase that instantly etched itself into political history: alternative facts. With those two words, she gave language to a new era where truth was negotiable, where power wasn't about accuracy but about audacity. Critics recoiled, late-night comedians feasted, but Conway never flinched. If anything, she doubled down, smirking as though the outrage itself was proof of her victory. It was this audacity that made her both feared and loathed. On live television, she could slice through opponents with rapid-fire talking points, overwhelming them not with evidence but with sheer speed and confidence. She rarely paused, rarely conceded, rarely allowed silence to hang in the air. For her, silence was weakness, and weakness was fatal. So she filled every space with words, even when those words bent logic to the breaking point. But arrogance has a way of planting seeds that eventually sprout into cracks. Over the years, the polished strategist began showing signs of fatigue. Long interviews turned into tirades. Calm deflections turned into defensive shouting matches. The once razor-sharp spin began to fray under the weight of repetition. The contradictions that had always existed, the cool operator versus the angry defender, began colliding in real time, and viewers started to see both faces at once. There were moments when her bravado seemed almost theatrical, as if she were aware she was playing the villain role and embraced it fully. She would lean back in her chair, smile smugly, and launch into monologues that felt less like arguments and more like dominance displays. Her confidence seemed bulletproof, her ability to twist a narrative unmatched. Yet just beneath the surface, there were flashes of something else: desperation. Because for all her success in manipulating the narrative, Conway could never fully escape the reality that she was tethered to a brand of politics defined by distortion. She had built her empire on spin, and the more she defended it, the louder she had to become. The louder she became, the more brittle her mask looked. And nothing exposes brittleness like live television. That was the contradiction the audience could sense. The polished strategist who seemed untouchable, but who occasionally cracked under the very spotlight she once commanded. The longer she remained in the public eye, the more those cracks became impossible to ignore. And on the night she faced Jasmine Crockett, those contradictions exploded. The Conway who once prided herself on control was nowhere to be seen. Instead, viewers saw the raw, unfiltered side, the arrogance without the polish, the bravado without the strategy. She wasn't spinning anymore. She was unraveling. For years, she had cast herself as the warrior who could never be cornered, the political gladiator who thrived on combat. But that image only works if you never lose. And in the studio that night, with millions watching, Conway wasn't winning. She was flailing, her screams revealing what her carefully chosen words once concealed: fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of being outmatched by a new generation that didn't play by her rules. Fear that the very tactics that had kept her untouchable for so long were finally crumbling under their own weight. And so, the villain stood exposed. The master of alternative facts, the woman who once seemed to bend reality itself, was now caught in the harshest reality of all arrogance can carry you only so far before it collapses under its own volume. The nation had seen Kellyanne Conway dominate debates, outshout critics, and shrug off scandal. But tonight was different. Tonight, the arrogance that once protected her had betrayed her. Tonight, the villain who seemed untouchable was suddenly within reach. And waiting on the other side of the table was Jasmine Crockett, calm, steady, unshaken, ready to turn Conway's unraveling into something unforgettable. Long before the cameras found her on Capitol Hill, before her calm reply stunned millions watching at home, Jasmine Crockett learned the art of holding her ground in places where her very presence was a challenge. She was not born into the halls of privilege or the safe comfort of political dynasties. Her journey began in working class neighborhoods where resilience was not a slogan but survival, where you learned early that if you didn't speak up for yourself, no one else would. It was there that Crockett's grit was formed, in the quiet struggle of proving herself against lurid expectations, in the daily grind of communities too often overlooked. She saw neighbors hustling to make rent, families fighting for dignity against systems that seemed designed to ignore them. These early experiences would later fuel her fire as a lawyer and, eventually, as a congresswoman. But even as a young girl, she understood instinctively what many politicians forget, that dignity isn't granted from above, it's demanded from below. Education became her weapon. She pushed herself, driven not by entitlement, but by determination to break ceilings that others insisted were too high. When she chose law, it wasn't for prestige, it was for power. The kind of power that could shield the vulnerable and hold the mighty accountable. Courtrooms became her proving ground, where she sharpened her arguments not with theatrics, but with clarity. She didn't need to scream to win a case. She just needed to know the facts better than anyone else in the room. And she did. Clients who couldn't afford high-priced defense saw in her not just an attorney, but an advocate who believed their stories mattered. She defended the poor, the overlooked, the one society too often treated as disposable. That fight carved something into her character, a refusal to bow when confronted with arrogance, a refusal to be silenced when the truth was on her side. Her transition into politics was almost inevitable. Texas needed fighters like her, voices willing to walk into hostile chambers and speak with unshakable conviction. When she won her seat in Congress, it wasn't on the coattails of privilege but on the shoulders of grit. She was sworn in with a reputation already forming, sharp, relentless, unwilling to tolerate disrespect, yet always anchored in composure. In hearings, she became known for her precision. When others raised their voices, Crockett raised her eyebrows, waiting for the exact moment to strike with words, so cutting they couldn't be ignored. Clips of her exchanges often went viral, not because she shouted the loudest, but because she sliced through nonsense with surgical clarity. She had mastered what Conway never could, the discipline of timing, the strength of restraint. Her colleagues began to whisper that she had the instincts of a prosecutor and the calm of a seasoned stateswoman. Supporters saw in her a rising star, someone who represented the America they believed in, diverse, unapologetic, unwilling to bend in the face of intimidation. For young women of color, she became more than a politician. She became proof that dignity could stand its ground against noise and win. But Crockett's strength wasn't just in her words. It was in the way she carried herself under fire. In a political climate designed to provoke, she refused to take the bait. When insulted, she smiled. When interrupted, she waited. When dismissed, she returned sharper than before. Her restraint wasn't passivity, it was strategy. A weapon she wielded with as much skill as any fiery rebuttal. And so on the night she sat across from Kellyanne Conway, Crockett wasn't nervous. She wasn't intimidated by Conway's resume, her television presence, or her reputation for combat. Crockett had faced louder bullies in courtrooms and more dangerous adversaries in her fight for justice. She had built her career in spaces where silence was expected of her, and she had turned that silence into a platform. That's why, as Conway erupted on live television, Crockett's stillness felt electric. She wasn't frozen. She was calculating. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was patient. She knew that storms burn themselves out, but composure can last forever. The viewers didn't just see a congresswoman that night. They saw the culmination of a life spent preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Every courtroom battle, every dismissive opponent, every attempt to silence her had only strengthened her resolve. She had endured condescension, disrespect, and arrogance for years, and each time, she had come back sharper, calmer, stronger. So when Kellyanne Conway tried to drown her out with screams, Jasmine Crockett had already been preparing her entire life for that exact moment. The studio was already rattled from Conway's outburst, but what followed was not a retreat into civility. It was escalation. Conway doubled down, her voice swelling with each interruption, hands slicing the air as though sheer movement might make her points land harder. She leaned over the desk, eyes flashing, her words colliding in a torrent that no one could quite follow. It wasn't argument anymore. It was volume, an avalanche of noise meant to bury everything else beneath it. The anchors tried to steer her back, their voices strained with the desperation of referees in a game spinning out of control. Kellyanne, let's allow Congresswoman Crockett to, one began, only to be steamrolled by another barrage. Cameras caught the nervous glances between producers through the glass wall of the control room, as if they were all wondering the same thing: how much longer before this completely fell apart? And through it all, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands folded lightly, her posture upright, her expression calm in a way that only heightened the drama. Where Conway's every movement screamed chaos, Crockett's stillness radiated control. She wasn't shrinking under the noise. She was waiting, studying, like a chess player across the board from an opponent who had already made too many reckless moves. The contrast was almost cinematic. Conway flailed, her words sharp but incoherent, her gestures betraying a desperation she couldn't hide. Crockett's eyes followed her without flinching, measuring each sentence as though she were dissecting it in real time. Viewers could feel the imbalance shifting, even before Crockett said a single word. Still, Conway pressed on. She jabbed her finger across the table, cutting off Crockett before she could respond, twisting her body toward the cameras as though sheer bravado could disguise the cracks in her performance. Her voice climbed, cracked, then climbed again. It was the kind of display that might have intimidated a less disciplined opponent, the kind of flood that forced others to either shout back or drown. But Crockett didn't either. She let Conway keep speaking, let the noise fill the studio until it was unbearable. The anchor's interruptions grew weaker, their attempts to calm the exchange fading into the background. The stage had become a two-person battlefield, and only one of them seemed aware of the rules. Viewers at home weren't just watching a debate anymore. They were watching a drama. Social media was already lighting up, clips spreading in real time with captions like, "Kellyanne losing it on live TV and why is Crockett so calm?" Hashtags began to trickle into trending lists, the digital audience amplifying the tension long before it reached its peak. And that was the brilliance of Crockett's silence. By refusing to meet fire with fire, she allowed Conway to burn through her energy unchecked. The louder Conway screamed, the more ridiculous the performance became. The calmer Crockett stayed, the more the balance of power shifted in her favor. The nation could feel it, an unspoken sense that something inevitable was building. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of Conway's interruptions, Crockett moved, not much, just a subtle shift, a lean forward that immediately pulled the oxygen from the room. It wasn't a shout, wasn't even a word yet, but it was enough to make Conway falter mid-sentence, if only for a split second. Enough to make the anchors glance toward her, relieved at the possibility of regaining control. Enough to make millions of viewers lean closer to their screens. It was the moment the entire confrontation had been building toward. The storm of noise was about to meet the stillness of composure. And then, with the nation glued to their screens, Crockett leaned forward. The room was still buzzing with the echo of Conway's voice when Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was deliberate, the kind of slow, confident movement that shifts an entire atmosphere before a single word is spoken. For a moment, even the anchors seemed to hold their breath, afraid that any interruption would break the spell. Crockett's eyes met Conway's, unblinking, steady, patient. And then silence, not the awkward silence of someone searching for words, but the chosen silence of someone who knows the entire room belongs to her. The contrast was devastating. Just seconds before, Conway had been flailing in a hurricane of noise. Now, the lack of sound felt louder than all her screams combined. When Crockett finally spoke, her voice was low, measured, and calm. "Kellyanne," she said softly, almost like a teacher addressing a restless student, "if shouting made lies true, this country would be in a very different place." The line landed like a hammer in velvet. The anchors froze, their faces betraying that rarest of live TV moments, genuine surprise. The control room buzzed with frantic instructions, but none of it mattered. Crockett had seized control of the narrative, and everyone knew it. Conway blinked, her mouth twitching as if ready to fire back, but Crockett didn't give her the chance. She continued, each sentence sharpened like a blade, each pause carefully calculated to let her words sink in. "You built a career on bending the truth until people couldn't recognize it anymore. Alternative facts, remember that. You turned confusion into a weapon. But the thing about weapons, Kellyanne, is that eventually they backfire." A murmur rippled across the studio. The anchors exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure whether to step in or let it play out. Crockett pressed on, her tone never rising, her delivery steady as a drumbeat. "Americans are tired. Tired of being yelled at. Tired of being gaslit. Tired of being told that their eyes are lying to them. And tonight, while you scream and point fingers, you're proving exactly why people are ready for something different." On social media, the moment exploded instantly. Clips of Crockett's words were cut, captioned, and shared in real time. The chat feed for the network's live stream filled with emojis, exclamation points, and lines like "This is how you handle a bully," and "She just ended her." Conway shifted uncomfortably, repeating fragments of her earlier points, her voice no longer commanding but defensive. She gestured wildly, trying to interrupt, but the momentum had already slipped away. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. Her composure made Conway look smaller with every second. "You see," Kellyanne Crockett continued, pausing long enough for the silence to sting, "I don't need to outshout you. I don't need to outspin you, because the truth doesn't need volume. It only needs clarity." The line hit like a lightning strike. Even the Yankees, normally bound by neutrality, couldn't help the slight smiles tugging at their faces. They knew they were witnessing a moment destined to replay endlessly across television, TikTok, Twitter, and dinner table conversations for weeks to come. Conway's hands fluttered nervously, her attempt at a rebuttal stumbling over itself. That's not how," she began, but the words faltered. For the first time, her confidence cracked opally on live television. Crockett leaned in just a fraction more, her voice dipping even softer, forcing the audience to lean closer to their screens. "You can scream, Kellyanne, you can pound the table, but the louder you get, the more America sees what's really happening, that you've run out of truth to stand on." And then she stopped, just stopped. No filler, no rambling, no extra words. She let the silence return, heavier this time, wrapping around the set like a curtain. It was silence with purpose. Silence that magnified every second of Conway's discomfort. The Anchors stumbled in to break it, their voices unsteady, caught between professional duty and awe at what they had just witnessed. One attempted to move to the next question, but it barely registered. The moment was already bigger than the debate itself. In homes across the country, people cheered. Progressive audiences flooded Twitter with praise. "This is why we need more Jasmine Crockett's in Congress." Memes appeared instantly, Conway red-faced and shouting, Crockett calm and unbothered with captions like "volume versus vision." Even celebrities began weighing in within minutes, retweeting the clip with fire emojis and applause. It wasn't just a takedown, it was a turning point. For years, Conway had thrived by dragging opponents into her arena of noise. But Crockett had refused to play the game. Instead, she flipped the script, exposing that beneath the bluster, there was nothing. And the brilliance of Crockett's delivery was that she hadn't overplayed it. She hadn't shouted back. She hadn't mocked or insulted. She had simply held up a mirror, and Conway had unraveled in her own reflection. The Anchors eventually regained composure, steering the segment toward other topics, but it didn't matter. The debate was over, not officially, not according to the schedule, but in the eyes of the audience. Crockett had delivered the mic drop heard across America, and Conway was left scrambling in the silence. As the broadcast wrapped, Conway forced a smile, masking her defeat with strained laughter. Crockett remained poised, gracious even, but the power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. The moment belonged to her now, a freshman Democrat who had stared down one of the GOP's most infamous warriors and walked away untouchable. But the story didn't end when the cameras cut. If anything, that's when it began. Because what happened after the broadcast ended might be even more shocking. By the time the debate wrapped and the credits rolled, the real show had already moved online. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation lit up Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram like fireworks on the 4th of July. One video slowed down to highlight Conway's face as Crockett delivered the line, "The truth doesn't need volume, it only needs clarity." Hit 1 million views in less than half an hour. The hashtag surged almost instantly. Hashtag Comscouse trended first, followed closely by hashtag Crockett clapback. A meme spread with dizzying speed. A split screen of Conway mid-shout and Crockett leaning calmly forward. Caption one brought the storm, the other brought the sunrise. TikTok creators added dramatic music, slowed replays, and even cinematic edits of Crockett's words, layering her calm delivery over swelling orchestral soundtracks. On Twitter, commentators went to work. Progressive activists hailed the moment as a cultural turning point, a masterclass in refusing to be dragged into the mud. One viral tweet read, "Kellyanne tried to drown Jasmine Crockett in noise. Crockett taught us that dignity is louder than chaos." Thousands of retweets followed, echoing the sentiment across timelines. But it wasn't just activists. Celebrities joined in. Kerry Washington tweeted, "This right here, a woman who knows her power." Mark Ruffalo posted the clip with the caption, "Truth doesn't need volume." Jasmine Crockett 2028. Even musicians joined the wave. Chance the Rapper clipped the line into a beat and teased it on Instagram. The reaction wasn't confined to social media. Cable networks replayed the exchange on loop, anchors marveling at Crockett's composure. CNN called it a defining moment of political theater. MSNBC ran with the headline, "From chaos to clarity, Crockett's commanding presence." Even some conservative outlets, usually quick to shield Conway, struggled to spin it. One Fox News panelist admitted, "She looked rattled. You can't watch that clip and not see who won." And then came the late-night shows. Stephen Colbert rolled the footage, pausing to mimic Conway shouting, then contrasting it with Crockett's unshaken calm. The audience roared. Trevor Noah quipped, "This wasn't a debate. This was a TED Talk versus a tantrum." Clips of the comedians added another layer to the viral storm, amplifying the humiliation for Conway and the triumph for Crockett. For many watching at home, it wasn't just entertainment. It was validation. The comments of Crockett against the frenzy of Conway resonated deeply with people who felt exhausted by years of political shouting matches, gaslighting, and noise. In comment sections, thousands wrote variations of the same message. Finally, someone spoke the way we feel. In immigrant households, the symbolism struck even harder. Parents told their children, "That's how you face a bully, not by becoming one yourself, but by standing taller." Young activists saw Crockett as proof that you didn't need decades of experience to command respect. You needed courage, composure, and conviction. Meanwhile, Conway became the punchline. GIFs of her red-faced shouting filled timelines, paired with captions like, "When your lies stop working but you don't know what else to do." A TikTok trend emerged where users lip-synced Conway's frantic interruptions while their friends sat calmly, mouthing Crockett's killer lines. But beneath the laughter was something deeper. The moment crystallized a shift, a yearning for politics that didn't have to be a screaming match, for leaders who could carry themselves with dignity in the face of chaos. Crockett embodied that, and people were hungry for it. Political strategists began weighing in. Op-eds appeared overnight, framing the exchange as a generational clash. Conway, the relic of Trump-era spin versus Crockett, the rising face of a new democratic ethos. The Washington Post headline read, "Crockett versus Conway wasn't just a debate. It was a battle for America's future." And through it all, the clip kept spreading. 10 million views by morning, 20 million by midday. Every share added fuel. Every hashtag kept the fire alive. For once, the underdog wasn't just heard. She was celebrated. The people felt seen, as if Crockett had stood not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever been shouted down, dismissed, or gaslit into silence. Her calm clarity wasn't just political theater, it was emotional release. By the end of the week, one truth was undeniable. Conway had lost control of more than just a debate. She had lost the narrative, and Jasmine Crockett, with her steady poise and precise words, had captured the nation's imagination. But as the applause reached a fever pitch, whispers began to surface. What would this moment mean for Crockett's future? And how would Conway, a veteran of political war rooms, strike back? Because if history had taught anything, it was this: after the shockwaves settle, the real battles begin. In the days that followed, as the viral storm settled into something more lasting, Jasmine Crockett did something few politicians manage after a viral moment. She reframed the confrontation into a universal truth. Reporters asked her what it felt like to have millions cheering her on, to be hailed as the voice of calm in the chaos. She smiled gently, but her words cut deeper than the applause. "This was never about me versus her," she said. "It was about what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to scream past each other? Or do we want to listen, stand firm, and move forward?" Her response transformed the spectacle into something bigger than a clash of personalities. Crockett was telling America that strength doesn't come from rage. It comes from composure under fire. Arrogance may dominate a room for a moment, but dignity reshapes the entire narrative. That message resonated far beyond cable news cycles. It echoed in classrooms, where teachers showed the clip as an example of grace under pressure. It reverberated in community centers where activists said, "This is how you face injustice, not by lowering yourself, but by lifting the conversation higher." And perhaps most profoundly, it landed in the hearts of people who had long felt silenced. For immigrants who had been told to speak louder to be heard, Crockett's calm insistence reminded them that clarity trumps volume. For women who had been interrupted in boardrooms, her patience was vindication. For anyone who had ever been bullied, dismissed, or drowned out by arrogance, the lesson was simple and liberating. You don't need to match chaos with chaos. You need to hold your ground, steady and unshaken. Crockett's moment carried an almost timeless echo. Throughout history, true moral authority has belonged not to the loudest, but to the steadiest, from the marchers who sang while being jeered at, to leaders who answered hatred with conviction. The pattern was the same: dignity endures, while arrogance burns itself out. In that television studio, with Conway shouting herself hoarse, America had been given a microcosm of that eternal struggle, and Crockett had shown which side of history she intended to stand on. This was more than political theater. It was a parable for democracy itself. Democracies survive not when every voice is the loudest, but when voices can disagree without drowning each other out. They thrive not on rage but on resilience. Crockett embodied that resilience, reminding the nation that shouting matches may grab attention, but composure builds trust. The lesson crystallized into a new kind of rallying cry: calmness over rage, dignity over arrogance, clarity over noise. It wasn't about silencing passion, it was about elevating purpose. And in that framing, Crockett's response became more than a viral clip. It became a mirror, reflecting back to America the choice it had to make in the years ahead. For her supporters, it was a moment of vindication. For her critics, it was a challenge they couldn't easily dismiss. But for the country as a whole, it was a reminder of something rare: that real power is not always in the volume of the shout, but in the weight of the truth spoken calmly. And so the clash between Kellyanne Conway and Jasmine Crockett would not be remembered for the scream that pierced the air, but for the silence that followed, the silence Crockett held, until her words cut sharper than any shout ever could. Because in the end, the moral was undeniable: chaos may shake the room, but dignity reshapes the world. And so, we return to that viral clip, the moment when chaos collided with composure, when Kellyanne Conway's shouting match became background noise to Jasmine Crockett's unshakable calm. Millions watched in real time as the script flipped, the so-called seasoned warrior undone, not by louder words, but by the strength of silence and the power of precision. This wasn't just political theater, it was a cultural moment, a reminder that in a world addicted to noise, dignity still matters. Crockett's calm reply didn't just win a debate, it etched itself into the national memory, proof that clarity and courage still carry weight in American life. Think about it. How often do we see arrogance crumble under its own volume? How often do we get to live, a lesson in what real leadership looks like? That's why people are still sharing, still talking, still replaying that clip. It wasn't just a takedown, it was a turning point. And now, it's your turn. If you believe that truth should rise above noise, if you believe that composure is stronger than chaos, then don't just watch this story, be part of it. Subscribe, share this video, and join a movement that values dignity over arrogance, purpose over spectacle, truth over the endless scream. Because one day, when the shouting fades, what remains are the voices steady enough to be heard. Jasmine Crockett showed us how it's done. The question now is, will we carry that lesson forward together? Hit subscribe, spread the word, and let's make calm courage go viral.